For decades, almost every card swipe in Europe and Canada quietly passed through the same two American companies, and nobody outside the finance world really thought twice about it. That's over. Europe just activated a payment alliance covering 130 million people specifically designed to route around Visa and Mastercard. And in Canada, policymakers are openly calling their own credit card dependence a national security threat. Two of America's most untouchable financial giants are facing something they've never really had to deal with before: a coordinated government-backed push to make them optional. Here's where we're headed. First, we'll look at what just happened in Europe, because the deal signed this year between the European Payments Initiative and a coalition of national payment apps is genuinely the biggest structural threat Visa and Mastercard have faced in their history. Then we'll get into the digital euro, the European Central Bank's even bigger long-term project, and why its own president says Europe needs this urgently. After that, we'll cross the Atlantic to Canada, where the numbers around Visa and Mastercard's market dominance are honestly staggering, and where a real policy conversation is now happening about building sovereign alternatives. Then we'll talk about the specific incident that turned this from an abstract policy debate into something Canadians actually worry about happening to them personally. And finally, we'll get into whether any of this can realistically dent two companies that process a combined $24 trillion a year. Let's start in Europe, because this is the part that should genuinely worry Visa and Mastercard's boardrooms. On February 2nd of this year, the European Payments Initiative, the group behind the digital wallet Wero, signed a formal agreement with the EuroPA Alliance, a coalition linking Italy's Bancomat, Spain's Bizum, Portugal's MBWay, and the Nordic region's Vipps MobilePay. That single agreement instantly connected roughly 130 million users across 13 countries, covering about 72% of the EU and Norway's combined population. Cross-border peer-to-peer payments through this network are launching this year, with e-commerce and point-of-sale payments following in 2027. Think about what that actually means. A Belgian consumer buying from an Italian retailer or a Spanish customer paying a French freelancer will soon be able to complete that transaction without it ever touching an American network. European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde put the stakes bluntly on Irish radio, saying Europe needs its own digital payment system urgently, and warning that virtually all European card and mobile payments currently flow through infrastructure the continent doesn't control. Brussels has started treating that data flow leaving European jurisdiction with every single tap as a strategic vulnerability on the same level as energy dependence, and this isn't some abstract worry either. Bizum alone already has more than 30 million users processing upward of 3.4 million transactions a day. Ideal dominates online payments in the Netherlands, and Swish is nearly universal in Sweden. Europe didn't build this from scratch. It stitched together infrastructure that already worked. Behind all of that sits an even bigger, slower-moving project, the digital euro. The European Central Bank has approved technical standards allowing payment cards and terminals to integrate directly with a future digital euro, aiming for a rollout by 2029, and it would carry full legal tender status alongside physical cash. Right now, roughly two-thirds of card transactions inside the Eurozone flow through international schemes, and Visa and Mastercard together account for 61% of card payments across the bloc. An extraordinary concentration for something as fundamental as how people pay for groceries. ECB board member Piero Cipollone summed up the underlying anxiety plainly, saying European citizens want to avoid a situation where the continent is overly dependent on payment systems that aren't in its own hands. Not everyone in Europe is thrilled about the pace, though. One payments executive warned that if geopolitical tensions worsen faster than expected, the digital euro's 2029 timeline could simply arrive too late to matter. A rare moment of European officials admitting their own sovereignty project might be moving too slowly for the moment they're actually living through. Now, let's cross over to Canada, where the numbers are arguably even more lopsided. As of last year, American-owned Visa and Mastercard controlled 96% of Canada's entire credit card market. 96%. Canada does have one genuinely sovereign payment rail, Interac, which dominates debit transactions and is used by 99% of banked Canadians for things like e-transfers and splitting a dinner bill. But there's no domestic equivalent for credit or online purchases, which means anything involving subscriptions, travel bookings, or in-app payments still defaults straight to American-owned networks. Policy analysts, including Vas Bednar, managing director of the Canadian Shield Institute, have started describing this plainly as a national security choke point rather than just a business inefficiency. Her argument is straightforward. Canadians have gotten very good at scrutinizing product labels to determine if something is genuinely Canadian, but almost nobody stops to think about the fact that the actual mechanism used to pay for that product runs through infrastructure controlled entirely outside the country. And this isn't purely theoretical anxiety either. There's a real example driving the concern, involving a Canadian citizen whose access to ordinary financial services got disrupted specifically because global commerce, for her case, had to route through an Americanized payment network. Cases like that are exactly what analysts point to when they argue these networks aren't just convenient plumbing. They're choke points that can be tightened by a foreign government's decisions with very little warning, in ways that have nothing to do with an individual Canadian's own creditworthiness or behavior. The conclusion being drawn in Ottawa policy circles is blunt. Economic sovereignty isn't only about what Canadians choose to buy anymore. It's increasingly about whether the tools used to pay for those purchases can be trusted not to be weaponized. So where does this actually leave Visa and Mastercard? To be fair, we should be honest about scale here. These two companies process a combined $24 trillion annually, and that kind of entrenched network effect doesn't get dismantled by a memorandum of understanding or a single strongly worded speech from a central banker. Critics of Europe's push have pointed out that card payments already work efficiently across the continent, and that some of this sovereignty framing is more political symbolism than an urgent consumer need. But symbolism backed by 130 million connected users and a central bank actively building rival infrastructure isn't nothing either. It's competitive pressure that's already pushing card networks to lower costs and improve their own terms just to keep up. The direction of travel is unmistakable regardless of how fast it ultimately moves. Both Europe and Canada have quietly stopped treating Visa and Mastercard's dominance as a permanent fact of life, and started treating it as a dependency worth actively engineering their way out of. So that's the full picture. Two of America's most dominant financial companies now facing a real government-backed effort on two continents to build around them rather than through them. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like and subscribe and let me know in the comments. Do you think Visa and Mastercard can adapt fast enough, or is this the beginning of a real long-term erosion?